What if one of the most famous stories ever told has been hiding in plain sight, but in the wrong century? For over 100 years, scholars have searched for the Exodus in the age of mighty pharaohs, towering monuments, unstoppable armies, global empires, and yet nothing conclusive. No shattered empire, no mass escape, no smoking gun. But what if we've been asking the wrong question? What if the Exodus didn't happen at the height of Egypt's power, but at the moment it began to fall apart? Let's step into a forgotten chapter of history, a crumbling dynasty, a vanished city, and a pharaoh whose name barely survived the sands of time. Was the Exodus real? That's the question we've got to consider. Now, let's begin with a simple but explosive detail. The Bible itself gives a chronological marker. According to 1 Kings 6:1, the Exodus occurred 480 years before the construction of Solomon's temple. That places the event around 1446 BCE, before the Common Era. Now, pause for a moment, because that date changes everything. Most modern reconstructions place the Exodus in the 1200s BCE, during the reign of Ramses II, Ramses the Great. It's a neat fit on paper. After all, the biblical text mentions the city of Ramses. But historically, well, that period doesn't behave like an Exodus. Egypt, you see, in the 13th century BCE was a superpower. Its armies dominated Canaan. Its administration was sophisticated and stable. Its monuments proclaimed confidence, not collapse. If a massive slave population had escaped, devastating the land in the process, you would expect a ripple, if not a tidal wave, in the historical record. But instead, silence. So what happens if we take the earlier date seriously? We land not in the New Kingdom, but in the 13th Dynasty of Egypt, a period many historians once dismissed as obscure and fragmented. But obscure doesn't mean irrelevant. Sometimes it means we haven't been looking closely enough. Let's consider an ancient city called Avaris, a city that really shouldn't exist. In Egypt's northeastern Nile Delta, there's a site known today as Tel el-Daba. In antiquity, it was called Avaris. And what archaeologists uncovered there is nothing short of extraordinary. This wasn't a typical Egyptian city. Instead, layer after layer reveals something different. Houses built in Levantine architectural styles, burials consistent with Canaanite customs, donkey interments, an unusual practice in Egypt, but common in the Near East, artifacts pointing to a Semitic population living in large numbers. In other words, Avaris looks exactly like what you might expect if a large group of people from Canaan had settled in Egypt. Sound familiar? The biblical narrative describes the Israelites entering Egypt, settling in the delta, the Nile Delta, and multiplying over generations. Now, here's where things get really intriguing. At a certain point in its history, Avaris is suddenly abandoned. not gradually, not over centuries, but abruptly. The population disappears. There are no clear signs of invasion, no evidence of prolonged decline, just gone.
They came in numbers, settling in the marshlands of the eastern delta. They built homes unlike ours, buried their dead in ways unknown to Egypt. We tolerated them, then relied on them. But the years turned strange. The river failed, order dissolved, and one night, they vanished. The storehouses stood silent, the fields lay empty. It was as if the gods themselves had driven them out, or led them away.
If the Exodus occurred around 1446 BCE, the Pharaoh of the story would not be the famous conqueror. Instead, we meet a shadowy figure from a fading dynasty, Pharaoh Dudimose. His name survives on a handful of artifacts, scarabs, inscriptions, but little else. No grand monuments, no triumphant campaigns, just fragments. But that's exactly what we would expect from a ruler presiding over collapse. You see, the 13th Dynasty was marked by instability, by rapid turnover of kings, by weak central authority, declining control over outlying regions. And then something dramatic happens. Egypt loses control of the Nile Delta. Foreign rulers, known as the Hyksos, move in and establish dominance. Think about the sequence. We've got a large Semitic population that's already living in Avaris. That population disappears, just vanishes. The region destabilizes. And soon after that, foreign Semitic rulers take control. Is that just a coincidence? Maybe, but it's a coincidence that raises some very interesting questions.
We were not always slaves. Our fathers came in peace, welcomed in a time of famine. But the years hardened. Kings rose who did not remember. We labored under the sun, building cities we would never inhabit. Yet the God of our ancestors had not forgotten us. When the waters turned against Egypt, when darkness fell and fear filled the streets, we knew the moment had come. We gathered what we could carry, and we walked away from the only world we had ever known.
Among the texts of ancient Egypt, one document stands out for its haunting tone. It's called the Ipuwer Papyrus. Now, this isn't a historical record in the modern sense. No, it's a lament. It's a poetic description of a society that's in collapse. But listen closely to its words. The Nile is described as blood. Servants abandon their masters. The social order is inverted. Chaos reigns throughout the land. Is this the Exodus? Well, we can't say for certain, but the parallels are striking enough to demand attention. It's as if Egypt itself is remembering a time when everything fell apart.
Behold, the river is blood, and men shrink from tasting it. The servant has become the master, and the master wanders in despair. Gold is worn by those who once had nothing. The land is overturned as a potter's wheel. Truly, laughter has fled, and the house of Egypt is in mourning.
And then There's the voice of the Bible itself. Now, here's a text preserved across millennia. It's a memory carried by a people. Let's listen to how it describes that moment.
And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot that were men, beside children. And a mixed multitude went up also with them.
It's a mass departure. Not just a handful of fugitives, but an entire population on the move. And notice that one detail. It says a mixed multitude. A mixed multitude. Not just Israelites, but others leaving Egypt as well. Which raises a fascinating possibility. Could this reflect a broader upheaval? A moment when Egypt itself was unraveling and many seized the opportunity to leave? So let's step back and assemble the pieces. We've got a biblical date pointing to 1446 BCE. We've got a Semitic population thriving in Avaris. We've got a sudden and unexplained abandonment of that city. We've got a weakened Egyptian state under the 13th Dynasty. And we've got a little-known pharaoh, Dudimose, as well as a period of chaos remembered in Egyptian texts. Each piece alone, of course, is not definitive. But together they begin to form a pattern. Not proof, but a possibility. One that challenges long-held assumptions. Think about it. History is rarely neat. We know that. It doesn't hand us clear answers wrapped up in certainty. But it does leave traces. It leaves fragments buried in the earth. It leaves names half erased by time. It leaves stories preserved in memory and in text. The Exodus may never be proven in the way modern historians demand. But the deeper we dig, the more we begin to see that the story is not without foundation. A city that vanishes, a kingdom that falters, a people who walk into the wilderness and change history forever. Perhaps the real question is not whether the Exodus happened exactly as written, but whether behind the story there lies a memory. A memory of something very real. Now, if you want more journeys into the hidden history of the Bible, into lost civilizations, into ancient mysteries, and the evidence behind the text, here's what you do. Subscribe to Jews, God, and History. Because the past isn't silent. You just have to know where to look and where to listen.